Hey, it's Damon, and I'm taking a quick moment to thank some contributors to the Who Am I Really podcast, Susie, Daphne, and Melinda. One of them was a guest on the podcast before, and another is an adoptive mom in an open adoption who said she learns a lot from listening to the adoption and reunion stories on the show. I know the majority of the Who Am I Really podcast's guests are adoptees, but it's also heartening to hear that adoptive parents and birth parents are listening to us too. We thank you for that. If you'd like to support more adoptee stories being told, changing the narrative about adoption, and helping people to open up with their truth, please go to patreon.com/WAIReally. Oh, and one more thing. Just a reminder that last week's guest, D. Yvonne Rivers, is launching a podcast for birth mothers called Birth Moms Real Talk. It will be available on all podcast platforms starting Saturday, June 26th, 2021. Here's Yvonne to tell you a bit more.
Hi, my name is D. Yvonne Rivers, and I will be launching Birth Moms Real Talk podcast. This is a podcast where birth moms will share their journey and chat with each other, allowing you to listen in. We will also cover hot topics and have a vibrant discussion on topics that other people do not want to touch. But these topics will allow us to heal and really bring closure and discovery. So follow us at our website at www.birthmomsrealtalk.com, on Facebook at Birth Moms Real Talk, as well as on Instagram, Birth Moms Real Talk. Join us. Looking for you to listen in.
Who am I?
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 This is Who Am I Really? A podcast about adoptees that have located and connected with their biological family members. This week's show is a rebroadcast of the 2020 Adoptee Podcaster Perspectives online event during National Adoption Awareness Month. My guests were Haley Radke, host of the Adoptees On podcast, and April Dinwoodie, host of the Born in June, Raised in April podcast. The knowledge they dropped and the elements of their personal stories will expand your mind and help you heal. Here's this week's show and the final episode of this season of the Who Am I Really podcast. I'll see you again for more adoptee stories in the fall of 2021. Welcome, everybody. My name is Damon Davis. I want to welcome you to the 2020 National Adoption Awareness Month Adoptee Podcaster Perspectives webinar. I'm joined today by Haley Radke and April Dinwoodie, and I'm going to get into introducing them a little bit more in a moment. I want to also invite you to raise any questions, comments that you might have in the chat box. We're going to try our best to get to any of those comments as soon as we can after we have a little bit of a discussion about our respective podcasts and their purposes, and then a little bit about ourselves. So without further ado, I wanted to sort of bring everybody together for a couple of different reasons. I felt like it was important to sort of celebrate the diversity that is the adoption community. We have so many different folks from various walks of life, from their various ethnicities, geographic areas. I mean, you could just go on as you try to sort of separate us out into who we are individually. But I think one of the things that unites us is the adoption experience. We can all kind of relate to some of the things that others have been through, and it generally kind of creates a kinship among us. I also wanted to offer an opportunity to discuss some adoption related issues, and it's best to bring folks together in a forum where we can do something like this. And who better than podcasters like myself, Haley, and April, who have been interviewing and trying to understand folks like us, like you, for a couple of years now and across multiple hundreds of episodes. And I just wanted to take some time and have some Q&A. There's a lot going on in the world, and I think that adoption issues are incredibly important. So I wanted to make sure that we created space to have these conversations. And of course, this is going to be an online resource for other adoptees to tune into whenever they get a chance. So I want to thank every one of you from across the adoption constellation for being here today. I'm really excited to see all of the faces here in the crowd. I'm thankful to my guests who I'm going to introduce now. So starting with myself, I'm Damon Davis. I run the Who Am I Really podcast. Who Am I Really is a show where I interview adoptees about their adoption experience and their reunion journey. It's a straight storytelling podcast. I launched it in March of 2017, and you can find the show online at whoamireallypodcast.com. You can find the show on social medias at WAI Really. I'm also going to introduce Haley Radke. Haley is the host and producer of an adoption podcast called Adoptees On. Adoptees On started in June of 2016 and recently crossed a major milestone, passing the 500,000 download mark. So props to Haley for an amazing show. Those downloads apparently span 140 countries around the globe, which I find absolutely fascinating. So welcome, Haley. You can find Haley online at Adoptees On podcast on Facebook. You can find her at Adoptees On social media, and I'll leave her to do some of the rest of her intro after I finish. But before I do that, I want to say a little quick word about April Dinwoodie. April is also an adoptee podcaster. Her show is Born in June, Raised in April. It was launched in February of 2016, is now in its 5th season. You can find her show online at aprildinwoodie.com, and you can find her on socials at June in April. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my show just so that you get a feel for it. And then I'm going to kick it over to Haley so she can talk a little bit about her show and who she is. So as you probably know, I'm an adoptee. I'm in reunion with my biological parents separately. And I should say quickly, I'm going to use the words biological and natural parents and things like that interchangeably. I don't mean them as any disrespect to anybody within the adoption constellation. I simply use them for clarity as to what that relation of that person is to me. So if you hear words that don't necessarily resonate with how you describe a biological relative, a natural relative, or what have you, just recognize that I'm using them interchangeably for those purposes of identification, not as a signal as to my closeness to that person, for example. So I was inspired to locate my biological family when my wife gave birth to my son. He was my first biological relative I ever knew, and it was an amazing experience. I also had some other experiences where I had family members who recounted history that just really helped me understand that there was a whole other family out there that knew a biological history of mine that I wasn't aware of. And it just really inspired me to seek out my natural relatives. So I was very fortunate. I found my biological mother working only 2 blocks away from me in Washington, D.C. I was able to reunite with her on her birthday for a surprise. And it was just an amazing experience. But one of the things that I realized was as I started talking to other adoptees, I realized not everybody's story was as heartwarming as I felt mine was. There were an array of different experiences. And so the more I talked to other adoptees about their experiences, the more I recognized I need to help these folks share their stories, their voices as to what happened in their adoption experience. So that was the reason that I started the Who Am I Really podcast. I've said a lot. I'm going to pause. I want to turn it over now to Haley Radke. Make sure you come off mute. I want her to tell us a little bit about herself, her adoption journey, and then tell us a little bit about your podcast and what made you get it started.
Thanks, Damon. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. And yes, I too am adopted, and I had a closed domestic adoption. I'm in Canada, and I reunited with my first mother in my early 20s, and we had a very brief 4-month reunion, and she cut off contact after that. And then about a decade later, I reunited with my first father, and I have 3 half siblings who are now all young adults. And we had a very tumultuous reunion. We had the honeymoon period followed by great problems, which led to a lot of counseling and digging up all of those hard things that make relationships challenging when you are related to people, but perfect strangers as well. And so I'll put a pin in that. I've listened to podcasts for years and years and years and loved podcasts before they were cool. I used to have to download them on iTunes and then transfer them over to my little MP3 player as I was walking to university to occupy my time on my walks. And so when I connected with some adoptees on Twitter, and we were connecting with how challenging reunion was, and I just was like, oh my goodness, there are more people like me. This isn't like the perfect happy reunion for everyone. And I just got inspired and really thought it would be amazing if we could share these conversations in podcast form. And one of the most beautiful parts about podcasts, and I think probably Damon and April will agree with me, is how intimate they are. We get to have a conversation one-on-one with our guest, but then sharing it with you, the listener, you're invited into the conversation and feel included. And I love that. That's one of my favorite parts about podcasting and why I've listened for so long. And so, yes, my show is called Adoptees On, and I've been podcasting for think about 4.5 years now, and I've just built a really amazing community around my show. And yeah, 140 countries, isn't that wild? I wrote down the top 5 just in case you're interested. So actually, though I'm in Canada, most of my listeners are American, about 70%, then Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Ireland, all of whom have their issues with adoption. So I think that's why majority of my listeners are from there. And on my podcast, I too do a storytelling part, as Damon does. And then I also have a healing series where I interview adoptee therapists and we talk about the actual issues that adoptees face. A lot of the times when people find my show, they think, oh my goodness, I didn't know anyone else felt this way. And so it's a really beautiful way of connecting, welcoming adoptees into the community, and just knowing that they're not alone. April, why don't you tell us about your show and yourself?
Hey, thanks, Damon and Haley, for making the space, and for everybody for being here. Community is everything to me and has grown to be such a container of healing and connectivity for my journey of transracial adoption. So I am a transracially adopted person. I appreciate you, Damon, so much for putting some context around language. I use family of origin, mother of origin, father of origin, family of experience, mother of experience, father of experience to talk about my adoptive family versus my birth family. But I toggle between language. Language is so critically important. So I spent a little bit of time in foster care and then was adopted into the Dinwoodie family, white community, white family, colorblind, the whole nine. So there was this layer of adoption and then an additional layer of differences of race and culture that was present in my experience, and virtually zero kind of holding or conversation or recognition of either one of those things within my experience as a child and through, adolescence into young adulthood until adulthood, which is where, the conversation gets to see the light of day, because I'm creating it through my podcast and in those conversations also creating conversations within my family of experience. I am in partial reunion with my family of origin on my mother's side. She was easy to find, hard to make a connection to, and ultimately she died without me meeting her again as an adult. And then my half siblings found me, and I am in reunion with my maternal side of the family. The inspiration for the podcast, one, was to create space for conversation and connection. It is a straight interview. It started as a personal narrative in some ways I was interviewing myself or just talking about my experience. And then it moved into an interview format, which is very straightforward. And the interesting additional layer of the way in which the content is curated is due in part to the fact that my mother of origin named me June Elizabeth, and my family of experience, my parents of experience, named me April Elizabeth, and they did not already know that I was June. And of course, I am born in, wait for it, October, because everything and nothing makes sense. But for the 4th month, April, plus 6, the 6th month, June, 4 plus 6 equals what? 10, October. So it sort of does add up. Constantly looking for that like way in which things make sense in adoption. That said, what I do is deconstruct the calendar on my podcast each month. I record monthly, or I release monthly, and have a theme. Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, all the things that track with many of us who are living and breathing in the world, and if you're not off the grid, are tracking with a calendar functionality. So we may not celebrate these holidays or hold them in a specific way the same, but we know they're coming. So that is sort of the way in which the podcast is constructed today. Lets us talk about our family experiences and our identity, differences of race, class, and culture, holidays, and some real practical stuff that I think a lot of parents who listen can put into action based on raising children today who are adopted. So it's kind of the gig. Started in February of 2016. And quick side note, my cousin, my first cousin, biologically connected to me through my mother, who I was in reunion with. It was all her idea. She said, April, you really should start a podcast. And so it's all her fault, cousin Madeline. But really, she encouraged me, and really, I'm so glad she did, because it's been certainly a healing journey for me. But the way in which I think the community responds is really sort of breathtaking sometimes, and really reminds me that even though it's hard to expose certain things about family, and I get sometimes have to have very hard conversations with my family, it's so worth it when you look at the long tail of what changes need to be made in adoption and foster care in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I appreciate each of you sort of sharing a perspective as to where you've come from in the adoption constellation, how you arrived at this point of podcasting about it. I think it's interesting to hear that kind of color from each of you. Haley, a longtime podcast listener who just said, you know what, I can help these stories come out by making my own show. And then obviously, April, your cousin, suggesting that you create a space for this kind of conversation. I think it's really cool. I wanted to ask each of you, we have, 100 guests here, and there could have been probably hundreds more. And in having spoken with each of them over time, we have all learned something new and different. I know I have sat on my show and listened to people and gotten a new perspective. I've learned a new piece of jargon in the adoption constellation. I have heard experiences where I thought I knew the direction of the story, and it's gone a completely different way. Some of them happy and wonderful, and some of them incredibly dark and surprising as to how people can treat each other as humans. What I would love to know from each of you, and April, I'm going to start with you. How has your perspective on adoption changed as you have interviewed more and more guests? You dissect the calendar as part of your podcast. How has your podcast experience changed how you think about adoption, either something that guests have said or just a dissection of the calendar as it applies to your own life? Tell me a little bit about what you think of when you think of where you used to be as opposed to where you are now as an adoption podcaster.
Well, it's a great question. And, I've always learning and always recalibrating kind of the experience of adoption, but there are some themes that sort of like are thread throughs that they keep coming up all the time. And it really is about a lack of ability, skill, will, all the things to lean into the tough parts of life, right? Adoption, my tagline of my podcast is what adoption can teach the world. I was very careful to add that tagline several years ago, because I don't like that our lives of adoption can be, you know, exhibits of, on some level, some of the hardest relationship identity work that there is, and facing the really hard things about our human existence. But I'm reminded every time I interview someone at the high level of intricacy of the experiences of adoption, and how when we are operating at the highest level of engagement through the professionals who surround us in adoption, through parents who are all parents in the adoption extended family of adoption, if we're operating at the highest level, that's what all parents should be operating at that highest level. And the irony is that what I've learned to come in kind of and link together in my brain, which I believe is true, if more parents operated the way in which adoptive parents should operate, steering into complexity, being open about identity formation, looking directly at trauma and support for healing, there'd be less adoption, right? Like it's like, if there's an irony in this like process of really deconstructing adoption through this, like every day, month by month, like here are the things that are happening. Well, what are we going to do about Thanksgiving? Who's around that table? How do we make symbolic, if we can't make real-time space for family of origin at that table, how do we make symbolic space for those folks, that they're not hanging on the edges? So I think I've just learned how to kind of process my own experience, but then also bring about this like heightened level of expectation of parenting and our human experiences and relationship experience. So hopefully that answers the question, but that's kind of, and I keep relearning it over. I keep learning it over and over and over again.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely appreciate the angle you're coming from there. You're right. There's a lot to be said for the consideration of how parents, be they parents of origin or natural parents, adoptive parents, are thought of, how they interact with us, be it in reunion or in our daily lives, in adoption, what have you. I mean, there's a lot of complex intricacy there that needs to be considered. And I think it's even lost on many of those folks that we're close to, be they adoptive parents or natural parents, what has transpired for us to have been transplanted from one family to another family. Like, I don't even know if they actually get it, right? And it sometimes takes a little while for that to be caught up for them. So Haley, let me ask you the same question. You have been podcasting for 4 years, and I'm sure that you started from a certain place, and that your experiences with interviewing folks over time, and especially as you've had this healing series, you've had experts on who have an array of different topics that they can convey to the audience as to their own expertise in trauma, in therapy and healing, and the adoption journey in general. How has your perspective changed from, say, podcast 1 to, the 5,000th download?
I think I started out knowing how challenging adoption was, especially from the adoptee perspective, and knowing that there was layers of grief and things there. And I actually have my bachelor's degree is in psychology, so I have a working knowledge of that field, but I'm not a therapist myself. But over time, I've learned more and more about myself, how much more healing there is to do, and about all the ways that adoptees can be taking good care of themselves, because there is so much pain. And I think that one of the sad things I've learned is really how deep the pain goes for so many of us. And we use that lingo, coming out of the fog. And for a lot of people, when they're coming out of the fog, it's really traumatic. And I used to sort of think of coming out of the fog as just like, oh, coming into this awareness that there is a loss in adoption and these other impacts for us about being disconnected from our family of origin. But when you really think about the psychological, emotional, literal neurobiological changes that have happened in our brains when we are separated from our first parents, yeah, that kind of blew my mind. And as I continue to learn more about that, I just learn how much I don't know.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer the question too, because the last thing you said really resonated. That was what got me to a point of really wanting to start a show where we interview folks about their own experiences, because I began to realize just in casual conversation with folks how much I didn't know. And so for me, I was talking to folks again about this, what could almost be termed a like a Hallmark made for TV tearjerker movie. Like this young kid goes away, goes to college and graduate school, blah, 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 has this great, amazing life, has a son, and then goes and finds his biological mother. And she's working around the corner and he surprises her on her birthday. Like it seems like a movie script. But as I spoke to other adoptees, I realized, some of them would say, "Yeah, my parents were horrible people, and they never should have had children." I've had people say, I located my biological relatives, and I just realized how different we are, and I chose not to have anything to do with them, or vice versa. They chose not to have anything to do with me, and I began to realize the array of experiences and how drastically different they can be. I've frequently referred to this image that I can't get out of my mind of like a soundboard in a music studio where it's got 10,000 knobs on it. And if you turn one knob or you slide one slide, you get a different sound. And that's kind of what I think the adoption experience can be like for people. Had I grown up in April's community with her parents, I would be a completely different person. You slide two knobs in it, you know what I mean? And so I just find it to be fascinating that we are all coming from such different angles, but have this shared experience of having been transplanted from one family to another. And then many of us trying to find our way back. And I can see questions in the chat about that. I'm going to remind folks, as you think of questions as we're talking, please go over to the chat. We are looking back and forth in the chat, and we're trying to find some of the questions that we'd love to answer. So stack them up in there, because there will come a time when we're going to have a little bit of Q&A. But before we get to that, I have another set of things that I'd love for us to go through, because Haley, April, and I sat before this call and we planned a little bit about what we wanted to cover for ourselves in terms of topics before we open it up for some Q&A discussion. And going back to you, April, one of the things that you talked about was the importance of doing our own personal healing, and you've alluded to that a couple of times. Do you want to just share some of your thoughts and your work around the personal healing space for adoptees?
Sure. It had long been my experience, been in the work, I would say, part-time for over 18 years now, starting my mentoring program, or adopted adults mentor to youth in foster care, to speaking what my white parents didn't know and why it turned out okay anyway, stuff, talking about race, class, and culture differences, and how to help professionals along this journey. I was blessed at the very beginning of all this to meet a handful of adopted adults that were my peers, that really created a sense of community for me. And it wasn't until later in my journey where I started to see how much pain our community was in and how we were treating each other. And so I was reminded of the importance of doing your own personal work along this journey if you are going to be putting your voice out there and being a purveyor of content, because it's too risky if you're not sort of leaning into, okay, what do I need? What does my self-care regime look like? because you're working with the dynamic of, you have a community to hold and to respond to, and to be responsible to on some level, right? And that community is the extended family of adoption. We, all those folks that are in that, which is wide and big, and our community grows, and we consider all of those people in the extended families. And then closer in, I have my own family to manage and deal with, right? And the things that I talk about on my podcast are often ways in which my family is exposed. I'm certainly exposed, but that's me, and I have agency to say what I am and am not going to expose. But then I'm in other ways exposing people who have really no interest in being part of a podcast, or didn't, they would have one if they wanted to. So I think that underpinning all of that is underpinned by like really making sure that there's mental health supports in my life, that there is yoga and upside down, stuff, inversions often, and exercise and water and all the things. I just feel like whether you're podcasting or not, the journey of adoption is one that requires a healthy bit of self-care. So I think it's an important thing that we all should be thinking about, but specifically if you're going to be putting content out, just putting that scaffolding around ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well said. And it's an interesting point, because I often think of the guests that I have who bring journeys and stories and challenges and traumas and joys and amazing, incredible experiences that they many times have or are struggling with. And I can see some comments in the chat alluding to this as well. And I try to help folks through it, but as was said, I'm not clinically trained. I'm just an empathetic listener. But I also recognize that we, as the podcasters, like, you come along on this person's journey as they're telling it, and you get emotionally invested in this person as well. And I don't know about y'all, but I have cried and laughed with so many guests over time. And some of that personal care is empathizing with the person and making sure that you create space for yourself to sort of decompress from the elevated emotion that you felt having been part of this person's journey for 60 to 90 minutes as you talk through the thing. And then as you think about the entirety of the adoption experience, and it's just how many different ways it can be sliced for the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, it's just really incredible. But I think you're absolutely right that there's an incredible piece of the self-healing, the acknowledgement of your own needs for care that is incredibly important. I'm going to turn it to Haley. I want to give her an opportunity to sort of respond to that, and then obviously ask or address the issue that she would like to raise. So Haley, over to you. Did you have anything that you wanted to sort of respond to in April's comments? And then what you wanted to talk about was the whole truth about adoption, not just the heartwarming reunions, but the entire truth. So let me give you a chance to respond to April, and then talk a little bit about telling the whole truth.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing our listeners don't get a chance to see is the conversations we have once we stop recording. So, Damon and April, you're mentioning, all of these really hard things that people will share with us. And, I've spent many times crying after we've recorded, and making sure that the guest still feels safe in sharing this episode. Is that something they still want to do? Because I'm not a reporter out to get them and put up some story that they're not comfortable with once we've chatted. I've never had that happen, have someone pull it. But and then also just making sure a lot of people after interviews with me, they'll feel the same as if they've had a therapy appointment. Again, I'm not a therapist. It's more just spending all that emotional labor for an hour, right? And they're so tired, and for a few days after, they might be feeling drained and all those emotions and things. And so I think part of my self-care, just like you, Damon, I'm that empathetic person, and I do feel like I'm taking it on, but I try and care of them after we chat. And so that for me feels like I'm also building into myself, because that's something I really, that's just me. I don't know. I can't help it, no matter how much my therapist tells me I need to cut that out. Um,
Yeah, I hear
but
you.
yeah, going to talking about the whole truth about adoption, I think that this is sort of how we got here, with thinking that all the adoptee reunion things are the heartwarming stories. Is that's what we see on the 6 o'clock news. And Damon and I talked a little bit about that when he was on Adoptees On a little while ago. And those are the things that are reported and shared. And those are the videos that go viral. Those moments at the airport when you're coming down the escalator and you have the hug moment. And it was always so upsetting to me that they don't show the after and the fights, and what it feels like to send off a nasty email because your bio dad didn't reply fast enough to your email, first one.
Right.
No, not from personal experience. That's just,
Right.
hypothetical.
As an example.
Yeah. So I think that in telling the whole truth, the good and the bad, and showing like the reality of things, that we're helping other adoptees who are going through a search and reunion experience know what to really expect. We've really failed adoptees in setting them up for this expectation of the honeymoon reunion, when that is only the first stage, if you're even lucky enough to get a reunion. And some
Hmm.
people don't even want a reunion. So telling the whole picture, I think, is really important. The other thing I wanted to say about podcasting, and especially these adoptee voices, I think that we are having a social impact, changing the adoption narrative for the general public. And in sharing the whole truth of the story, we're really challenging people's preconceived notions of what adoption is. And not just that, we are, I don't know if you want to hear this, listeners, we are training listeners to have language that they can repeat to their friends and family to tell the whole truth about adoption. And so there is a huge ripple effect when we share the whole experience, the good and the bad. And I also want to add this, that you always want to do that from a safe place, because it's not always the right time for you to tell your whole truth. But it is when coming from a place of healing, as April said, that's when we can really share the whole adoption experience, the good and the bad. And I think will really impact society.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about some of the stories that I've heard. And one of the things that, well, I've heard, and I'm sure you guys have heard from your guests, because you alluded to it, Haley, the idea that speaking to another adoptee about your experience, and in many cases, it's the first time they've ever shared their entire journey with somebody. And even if they've shared three-quarters of it, half of it, the person that they were speaking with was unlikely to be able to truly empathize with what it was that they were conveying that they had been through. And that piece, I feel really appreciative of the fact that they're trusting us with their journey, right? They're literally opening their heart in a way that has never happened before. And as my guest, I want to respect that and welcome it in, and support it so that they can feel comfortable sharing the entire thing. On the flip side, I've had an occasional guest say to me, after my show, my family listened to it and they never realized my perspective until they heard me tell it to you. And so they get, and my sense is that our shows are offering this truth into the world about adoption that has never really been done before, because it's the adoptee's story as told by the adoptee, especially in my case. But in the healing series or other opportunities, the ways that you dissect things, April, are other opportunities. But the idea that you're able to bring these things to light for others to listen to, and I've joked about Every once in a while, I'll get a natural mother who will email me, or I'll get someone else who is sort of what I like to refer to as adoption adjacent. They have not grown up with their natural father, and then they find out that the person they grew up with wasn't their natural father, and they go on this quest to find the real person. And so they can totally relate to these adoption journeys that we help to convey. And I feel like people, it's like I was joking with somebody, when you're a parent and you're driving along in the car and your kids are in the back and they're talking like you're not even in the car. So you get to hear all of their thoughts, but you're not saying anything because you want them to just keep going. It's kind of like that with these podcasts to me, that we are openly expressing ourselves, and anybody who's listening can come in and sort of listen in on what we're saying and begin to empathize. And I think that that's incredibly important. I think it has concentric circles going out. It starts with us. It then goes to the families whom we're connected with, be they natural or adopted. And then it goes out to a broader community of folks who may be sensitive or at least aware of adoption issues. So I appreciate your points. We've got a lot of questions coming in to the chat, which is really exciting for me. I hope April and Haley, you guys have been tuning into the chat to select some that you would like to address. And let me just ask you real quick, do you have some that you're seeing in the chat that you want to start off with?
There are a couple, and then there's one thing I wanted to sort of just put a bow on, which is
Go ahead.
the fact that all of this is relational risky business, right? Because we have our family of origin to manage. If we are in reunion with them, we have our family of experience to manage. We also have our community to manage. So it's a high level of risk. The reward on the other side, though, is to Haley's and your points, a much more authentic relationship to the experience and to really hard things. And it requires us to get more practice in the hardest parts of our shared humanity, right? We really have to practice. And many of us aren't practiced in that. Our job is to sort of show people the way on some level through these narratives, but again, risky business. And with that little kind of connection point, there's someone who asked a question about being accepted as a transracially adopted person, Black, biracial, I think that was one of the questions I see in here. Were you accepted? What's interesting is the thread through on the adoption experience as well, because truth be told, there are times when white people don't accept me and Black people don't accept me. There's also, truth be told, there are times when I've really done a number on both family of origin and family of experience because I've spoken my truth, right? So there's this connectivity to the both and of navigating those worlds, and what that requires. And this is where the hardest piece of this is. It requires us to be really solid in our identities, in our racial identities, in our adoption identities, in order to be out in the world and sort of come up against that, who do you think you are? You're not Black enough. You're not white enough. Your family's weird. You don't have your medical history. So with that in mind, my headline to all of this is to folks: if you're an adopted person navigating differences of race, your own, in space and time that we're in, keep on that path of racial identity, and require those folks around you to do their personal racial identity work as well. But if you're a parent and you're a professional in any of those realms, don't let adopted persons do it on their own. We need your help. We need you to elevate how you're moving through these experiences on our behalf and understanding the complexity, because especially when differences of race and culture are part of it, because we find ourselves in isolated and unique situations, from family structure to our racial identities. And we oftentimes need that scaffolding and that support that we don't get.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Wow. Haley, do you see any questions, or I know we've gotten some questions, many of us over social media. Tell me what kinds of things are you seeing that you'd like to tune into?
Well, I just wanted to note there was a question about how did we find our parents? And I think a lot of us have shared our stories on our podcasts. So if that's something that you want, maybe we can provide some links to episodes where we've told our stories.
Mm-hmm.
I know April and Damon have both been on the Adoptees On podcast, and we've had a whole little thing going.
Yeah.
So I just like to note that for you. There's a lot more content out there where you can hear those things.
Yeah, just say quickly, how did you locate let's just do it really fast for folks who don't know. Tell us how you found your natural family, Haley.
I live in a province that has open records, was
Mhm.
able to get my open records, and my maternal grandparents still lived at the same address. So I was a phone book searcher to confirm that they were at the same address, and wrote a letter to find my first mother. And then my biological father has a unique last name, so I found him on Facebook.
Wow. April?
I used a search angel, which is, for those who don't know, largely volunteer or low cost, usually members of the adoption community who will search on behalf of those of us who are looking, usually adopted persons. And the search got real when I got organized. Once I put everything in a binder, literally, like, it was like the light bulb started to go off, and it's like, it was just, everything was a mess until I put it in some order, like off to the races. I'm not suggesting that happens for everyone, but that was just me. It was like symbolic and spiritual and all the things. Once that happened, my mother of origin was actually quite easy to find. The harder part was making a relationship with her. And again, she passed before I got to meet her again as an adult. My father of origin, due to very extreme circumstances around my conception, sexual violence, rape, my mother of origin, in the couple of conversations I had with her, would not give me any information about my birth father. So I'm still on all the DNA sites and trying to track to, genealogists and stuff to see if we can find him. So I'm hopeful, but cautiously optimistic about all of that, that whole reality of my coming into the world and the, how I was conceived.
Yeah. So I've also had Haley and April on my show, so we can all share out links to the interviews that we have done with one another so that you can hear us each tell our full stories from them. But in my journey, I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and I always knew that. So I reached out to